Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we have to talk about the US Department of Justice and our protections online when we are basically doing whatever it is we're doing on social media or anywhere else, because the Justice Department apparently wants disinformation to spread online thanks to some new rule changes they've proposed, and I think this is rather shocking, and we need to dive in. Now, this is coming from multiple sources. I'm cribbing primarily from Ars Technica that had an excellent article on this. Now, the Department of Justice here in the United States on September 23rd, that's this past Wednesday, proposed a recalibration of one of the most important laws governing the U.S. internet, and basically are urging legislators, meaning Congress, to act to remove a liability protection on which nearly every single website and app currently relies upon in the United States. What we are talking about, as I mentioned, is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that has been in place since 1996. Now, it currently reads, the part that they are talking about specifically reads, and I quote, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." Basically, this gives platforms and providers like Facebook, for example, broad discretion on one, how they choose to moderate whatever anybody of their users, or rather whatever their users put on, but it also puts the liability for the publication of a post on the user. So if I put up something that is criminal on, let's say, my Facebook account, Facebook is not liable for my criminal misconduct, and therefore is protected, and which also then protects every other user that isn't putting out criminal material on there. And so the question then becomes, what is the DOJ, the Department of Justice, proposing here? Because they actually want to alter that. Now, here's what's going on. The proposal basically, or I should say, while the proposal leaves the core principles of Section 230 unaltered, it applies a huge qualifier, though, and that is kind of a terrifying prospect. Now, that qualifier says that the existing law won't apply, and I quote, "to any decision, agreement, or action by a provider or user to restrict access to or availability of material provided by another information content provider." Basically, what they're saying here is that a service provider like Facebook or Twitter would not be permitted to block users from sharing websites, for example, that are things like hate sites or disinformation or anything else. They wouldn't be able to moderate it in that way. The proposed new bill, basically legislation, also adds several explicit carve-outs for the law as well. The first one is a bad Samaritan carve-out, exempting a platform from qualifying for the immunity that Section 230 provides if it, and I quote, "acted purposefully with the conscious object to promote, solicit, or facilitate material or activity that the service provider knew or had reason to believe would violate criminal law." Basically, using Facebook as an example, if I were to post something, let's say, illegal there, or let's say very hyperbolic or disinformation, something that Facebook would essentially not want on their site, would censor me or block me to do that, that could potentially be criminal on their part, or they could be liable with me if for whatever reason, let's say I had some very well-known bias or illegal activity or something like that, and Facebook was permitting me an account on that system. That is a huge, massive gray area. And to continue, criminal material also has an explicit carve-out that would require platforms to remove or restrict access to that material and report it to law enforcement as soon as they received notice of it, something like a mechanism very similar to copyright takedown requests through the DCMA or the DMCA by virtue of that. So I can go to them and say, hey, somebody has just ripped me off, and they're taking credit for my work, and then basically the DMCA can go to that website and say, you need to remove that. I've actually had that case with somebody blatantly just ripping off one of my articles from Forbes, and that was a whole thing. So that is what they are looking to do, something similar, with the Facebooks or Twitters. Now, the last carve-out applies to a quote-unquote judicial decision. Now, if a court rules that any content posted to a service is defamatory under state law or unlawful in any respect, platforms would have to remove that content as well. And so basically, if you are looking at this from the subset of this entire United States Supreme Court battle, if we have, let's say, a court system or a court itself that is lopsided to one spectrum or the other politically, could this be used as a bludgeon? We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the last page of the proposed legislation adds a list of good faith requirements. In order to be considered acting in good faith, a platform like Facebook must have a publicly available terms of service that includes its moderation rules, must moderate content, quote unquote, consistent with those terms of use, must not block content on, and I quote, deceptive or pretextual grounds. That's an interesting one. And must apply the entity being moderated with, quote unquote, reasonable factual basis for the restriction of access and a meaningful opportunity to respond. And to continue, and I quote, a platform that chooses not to host certain types of content would not be required to do so. That is how the Attorney General, William Barr, described this to Speaker Pelosi and Vice President Pence. And to continue, and I quote, but it must act in good faith and abide by its own terms it must abide by its own terms of service and public representations. Platforms that fail to do these things should not enjoy the benefits of Section 230 immunity. Now, companies are already required to adhere to the terms of service they are providing to the customer. That's not new, so that's a rather, I think, shaky ground to stand on because they're already doing that, because the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission here in the United States, is responsible for enforcing consequences on those companies, and it has actually had to do that in terms of misleading or deceptive terms of services, and they have gone after both Facebook and Twitter for that exact thing, leveling fines on both of those companies. And so my thoughts on this here, I think, is simply this. Like Russia, for example, if they ran a disinformation campaign, or anybody ran a disinformation campaign, Facebook under these rules couldn't really essentially restrict that in some way. They couldn't. Even demonstrably false information would have a problem. Also, this is coming from an administration that is rather vocal on what it perceives as an anti-conservative bias on Facebook, even though recent studies have shown that essentially Facebook has been less restrictive of conservative political positions in the United States out of fear that they're going to be labeled as a censor. So it's kind of a bit of a catch-22 there. I'm also wondering what's happening or what's going to happen to smaller alternative social media platforms that have sprung up to cater to both the left and the right political spectrums, and what happens when they are held liable or get exempt from these kinds of things. I have set up accounts on these smaller social media sites just to check them out. I'm thinking like Parler, MeWe, and some others just to check them out, and kind of do my research and my homework. I'm not really active on them, although my daily videos and podcasts are posted there. And I have seen probably, and I get criticized quite a bit for my videos, but I have seen a much larger and angrier user base, especially when responding to my videos and podcasts. There is no discourse on any of my stuff like there is on LinkedIn or Facebook, where people can disagree with me in the spirit of conversation and usually be respectful. I have literally been called every name in the book that you can think of, from fascist to communist, and if both sides are calling me the opposite, I must be doing something right. A tool of the state, and even, and I quote, I had to go look this one up again, but this is true, an acolyte for the Zionist Jewish international cabal that is hell-bent on destroying civilization. Yes, I have been called that as well. So how do you even begin to find common ground for an honest discussion with a person like that? And does that person now have the ability under this law, this revised Section 230, to go ahead and complain in some way, shape, or form and get somebody banned because of whatever the content or lack thereof, if I'm considered a bad Samaritan? I think this is something that we really need to think about. Now, think about this as well. Depending on which party is in power, whether it's the left or the right in this country, could this be used to censor or attack one side with fines and threats of closure or the revocation of Section 230 protections? Could this be a rather massive bludgeon that one side could use to silence dissent and restrict open ideas of those they disagree with? I think that's food for thought. But I think this opens the door for it in the same way that if we look at, let's say, creating rules that are not actually laws and then sticking to them, we have every right to, or not every right, but there is no reason why somebody couldn't be hypocritical and change that and just abandon the rule when it seems to suit them. This is a concern, and I think it's something that we need to address, But I think Section 230 as it is, while I don't think it's necessarily perfect, and I do think we have issues, and I do know that Facebook and Twitter need to step up their game. They've needed to do this for literally years, and they're now starting in months, which I do think is too late. This makes it rife for, I think, a lot more controversy because it may tie their hands in a way that they just don't have their hands tied right now, and remove some of the flexibility they have to actually call out disinformation for what it is, or remove basically users, groups, or whatever it is that they think they need to. So that's the thing. Who's going to censor us? Is the government going to censor us, or is a private corporation going to censor us? And is there a balance between the two? Should we be censored at all? And if so, we take the good with the bad, with the demonstrably false that a good portion of the population will actually believe as it spreads like wildfire. It's not an easy question to answer, and I don't think there's a really good, perfect answer that's going to satisfy everybody, but we have to come up with a working set of rules, I think, in order to make just the internet work. And right now, I think we've got those, and I think they need to be tightened, not loosened in some ways. So there you go. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. Please feel free to call me an idiot or a acolyte for the Zionist Jewish international cabal that is hell-bent on destroying civilization, or anything in between. But all I'd like is an honest discussion, because this is a very serious issue. And as the world here, or rather the United States here, is focused on things like the replacement of Justice Ginsburg, who recently passed away, this is being put through legislation, and we can't let these things go, and we can't let them fly under the radar, because that could fundamentally change essentially how we interact with the internet, how the internet interacts with us, and how it allows us to publish our thoughts and content. So take that for what it's worth, but that is your news of the day. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, guys.